Reinhard Heydrich was not just another officer in the Nazi machine. He was the machine's cruel precision incarnate. Tall, sharp-featured, and with an icy intellect, Heydrich was often described as the most dangerous man in the Third Reich. Heinrich Himmler himself once called him the man with the iron heart. By 1941, he had risen to a position of immense influence, serving as the chief of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, overseeing the Gestapo, the Kripo, and the SD, effectively controlling the secret police, criminal investigation, and intelligence apparatus of Nazi Germany. But Heydrich's ambition went beyond bureaucracy. He was a visionary of terror, an architect of genocide, and the man who organized the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution, the plan for the extermination of Europe's Jews, was formally set in motion. His ruthless efficiency and organizational genius made him indispensable to the Nazi regime. Hitler saw him as a man who could bring order to chaos, and in 1941, he appointed Heydrich as the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the modern-day Czech Republic, to crush the resistance movement and ensure the region's industrial productivity for the German war effort. When Heydrich arrived in Prague, he brought with him a reign of terror. He immediately imposed martial law, ordered mass arrests, and executed resistance members in public to send a message. The Czechs, already weary under occupation, were plunged into a new level of fear. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing. The brutality that Heydrich unleashed did not break the Czech spirit. It hardened it. Underground networks began to form, coordinated by the Czech government in exile based in London. Meanwhile, in London, the exiled President Edvard Beneš and his intelligence officers faced a dire problem. The Allies questioned the legitimacy of the Czechoslovak government in exile. The Munich Agreement still cast a long shadow, and the world doubted whether the Czechs could truly fight back. To regain credibility, Beneš needed a bold, symbolic act of resistance, something that would shake the Nazi establishment to its core. In the fall of 1941, the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, agreed to train a select group of Czech paratroopers for a mission that could change everything. Among them were two men who would become legends: Jozef Gabčík, a Slovak soldier with steely resolve, and Jan Kubiš, a Czech with nerves of steel and unwavering patriotism. Their mission, known as Operation Anthropoid, had one objective: assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich, confident in his invincibility, traveled daily through Prague in an open-top Mercedes, accompanied only by his driver. He refused to use an armored car, believing the Czechs were too terrified to strike back. This arrogance would be his undoing. As the training in Scotland began, Gabčík and Kubiš studied maps, learned sabotage tactics, and practiced parachute jumps into occupied territory. They knew the odds were nearly impossible. The Gestapo's network in Prague was vast, and a single mistake could lead to catastrophic reprisals. Yet, for these men, this was more than a mission. It was a message to the world. The Czechs would not remain silent under tyranny. By December 1941, their plan was ready. They would parachute into the Protectorate, link up with the local resistance, and strike at the heart of the Nazi elite. But as they prepared for their fateful jump, none of them could know that their act of defiance would trigger one of the most brutal retaliations in the history of the Second World War, and forever change the course of Czech history. The storm was gathering over Prague. On the freezing night of December 28, 1941, a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber took off from Tempsford Airfield in England, carrying a group of Czech and Slovak paratroopers bound for occupied Europe. Among them were Jozef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, the two men selected for the most dangerous mission of their lives, Operation Anthropoid. Their target was one of Hitler's most feared subordinates, Reinhard Heydrich. The bomber flew low across the North Sea, dodging German radar. The wind battered its frame, and ice clung to the wings. Inside, the men sat in tense silence, gripping their parachutes, each lost in thought. They had memorized every detail of the operation, the coordinates, the terrain, the resistance contacts, but the enormity of what they were about to attempt pressed heavily on their minds. They weren't just striking a target. They were challenging the invulnerability of the entire Nazi regime. As the aircraft reached the Czech border, a storm rolled in. Visibility dropped, and the pilot, flying without modern navigation aids, struggled to find the drop zone. Due to the weather and miscalculations, the paratroopers were dropped miles away from their intended location near Plzeň. Instead of landing near their designated coordinates, Gabčík and Kubiš found themselves near the small village of Hnězdí, east of Prague, deep in enemy territory. The landing was rough. Kubiš was injured when he hit the frozen ground, his parachute canopy collapsing awkwardly. The men quickly buried their parachutes and retrieved their equipment, including a Sten gun, grenades, false papers, and food rations. They knew the Gestapo constantly patrolled the countryside, and locals risked death if caught aiding them. Despite the setback, they pushed forward through the icy fields, determined to reach Prague and connect with the underground resistance. For days, they trudged through snow-covered landscapes, hiding by day and moving by night. They relied on the help of brave villagers and members of the local resistance who, at great personal risk, gave them shelter, food, and directions. Every knock at a door was a gamble, the difference between life and betrayal. Yet the Czech resistance network proved remarkably resilient and loyal. Eventually, the paratroopers reached Prague, where they were sheltered by resistance families such as the Moravics, who would later pay the ultimate price for their courage. Using forged identities, Gabčík and Kubiš blended into the city, adopting the routines of civilians. They met secretly with leaders of the resistance, including Jozef Gabčík, who had also parachuted into the region on another mission, and others involved in coordinating sabotage and intelligence for the Allies. Over the following weeks, the team began gathering intelligence on Heydrich's daily movements. They learned that he followed a consistent route from his residence in Panensk-Brezny to Prague Castle, usually in an open-top Mercedes with minimal escort. His arrogance was legendary. Heydrich believed himself untouchable. He even refused to allow additional security despite warnings from his subordinates. The paratroopers realized that the best opportunity would come when Heydrich's car slowed down on a sharp curve along Holsova Street in Prague. The plan was to attack there, where the road forced the vehicle to decelerate. Gabčík would open fire with his Sten gun, and if anything went wrong, Kubiš would throw a specially modified grenade to finish the job. While they prepared, they lived under constant threat. The Gestapo's reach was everywhere. An overheard conversation, a suspicious glance, or an intercepted letter could doom them all. To make matters worse, winter in Prague was harsh. Supplies were scarce, and morale fluctuated between determination and quiet dread. Yet through it all, Gabčík and Kubiš never lost focus. They also knew what their actions would bring. Beneš and the Czech government in exile were clear. If they succeeded, the Nazis would retaliate brutally. Villages could be destroyed, innocents executed. Still, both men accepted their fate. To them, the act of striking down Heydrich wasn't just vengeance. It was a statement of national pride and human defiance. By early May 1942, after months of careful surveillance and coordination, everything was ready. The weapons had been tested, escape routes planned, and the resistance network was prepared for the aftermath. On May 27th, they would make their move. The calm before the storm had ended. The hunters were ready, and their prey was approaching. Unaware that his fate would soon explode on a quiet Prague street, sending shockwaves through the Nazi hierarchy and changing the course of Czech resistance forever. The morning of May 27, 1942, began like any other for Reinhard Heydrich. The butcher of Prague ate breakfast in his estate at Panensk-Brezny, reviewed official documents, and prepared to make the familiar drive to Prague Castle. His chauffeur, SS Oberscharfer Johannes Klein, polished the sleek, open-top Mercedes-Benz 320 convertible B that Heydrich favored. It was a symbol of arrogance and power, unarmored, unescorted, and perfectly visible to the occupied city he ruled with terror. For Jozef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, it was the day they had lived and trained for, the day that would define their lives and echo through history. They had chosen the ambush point carefully. A sharp hairpin turn on Kobylska Street, often referred to as Holsovas Road, in the Prague suburb of Liben, near a tram stop. The curve forced Heydrich's car to slow to nearly a crawl. It was the perfect place to strike. At around 9:30 a.m., the two men arrived at the site. Gabčík carried his British Sten Mk2 submachine gun, concealed under his coat, while Kubiš held a modified anti-tank grenade, hidden inside a briefcase. The weapon had been altered with a time fuse, It would detonate seconds after impact, allowing the thrower a narrow chance to escape the blast. Resistance lookouts were positioned nearby to signal when Heydrich's car was approaching. They waited in tense silence. The air was thick with anticipation. Trams rattled past. Pedestrians went about their morning routines, oblivious to the history about to unfold. Then came the signal, a flash of sunlight from a mirror in the distance. Heydrich's Mercedes was approaching. As the car rounded the corner, Gabčík stepped into the street, raised his Sten gun, and aimed directly at Heydrich. But in that crucial moment, disaster struck. The gun jammed. The weapon, which had been smuggled from Britain and maintained in hiding for months, failed to fire even a single shot. For an instant, time seemed to stop. Heydrich stared in disbelief at the man standing in front of him, weapon in hand. Then, in a shocking display of arrogance and aggression, Heydrich ordered his driver to stop. Instead of speeding away, he decided to confront the attackers himself, a fatal mistake. Gabčík froze for half a second, realizing the gun had misfired, before diving for cover behind a lamppost. As Heydrich's car halted and the SS officer began to rise from his seat, Kubiš acted instantly. He tore the modified grenade from his briefcase, pulled the pin, and hurled it toward the car. The grenade hit the rear fender, just behind the right front wheel, and exploded with deafening force. The blast tore through the vehicle, ripping apart the upholstery and filling the air with smoke and shrapnel. Both Heydrich and Klein were thrown violently from their seats. Heydrich clutched his side, screaming in pain as metal fragments and horsehair from the car's seat penetrated his abdomen. Kubiš, caught in the blast, was wounded by shrapnel to his face and arms. Dazed and bleeding, he staggered away, jumped on his bicycle, and disappeared into the city's winding streets. Gabčík, still holding his jammed Sten, exchanged shots with Klein, who had drawn his pistol despite being injured. Gabčík managed to escape, sprinting down a side street and vanishing into the crowd. The entire attack had lasted less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the once invincible Reinhard Heydrich lay mortally wounded on the cobblestones of Prague. His white gloves were soaked in blood, and his pistol had fallen from his grasp. Civilians and German soldiers soon rushed to the scene, helping lift the injured SS leader into a truck that sped him to Bělovka Hospital. At first, doctors believed he would survive. The wounds appeared serious but not fatal. A ruptured spleen, broken ribs, and deep internal injuries. Surgery was performed immediately, and for several days Heydrich seemed to recover. Hitler, upon hearing the news, was enraged but hopeful, declaring that the perpetrators would be hunted down and executed. But infection soon set in. The horsehair stuffing from the car seat, driven deep into Heydrich's body by the explosion, caused septicemia. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, Heydrich's condition deteriorated rapidly. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany, died. The assassination sent shockwaves through the Nazi hierarchy. Hitler was reportedly apoplectic with rage, calling for a bloodbath of unprecedented scale. Himmler ordered an immediate investigation, placing the Gestapo on high alert. Prague became a city under siege, every citizen a potential suspect. Posters offering enormous rewards for information appeared overnight. What had begun as a daring act of resistance now unleashed a storm of vengeance. Within days, the entire machinery of Nazi retribution was in motion, and the Czech resistance would soon face the unimaginable. The death of Reinhard Heydrich on June 4, 1942, ignited one of the most brutal waves of retribution in the history of Nazi-occupied Europe. Hitler's fury was volcanic. Heydrich had been more than a high-ranking officer. He was one of the regime's intellectual architects, a man Hitler saw as a future ruler of Central Europe. To have him struck down in broad daylight by inferior subjects of a conquered nation was an unforgivable humiliation. Within hours of Heydrich's death, Berlin issued orders for immediate and total reprisal. Himmler personally arrived in Prague to oversee the investigation and vengeance. The Gestapo, the SS, and security police unleashed a campaign of terror that would drench Bohemia and Moravia in blood. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, and tortured as Nazi officials sought the perpetrators of what they called the most insolent assassination in modern history. The first step was symbolic. A state funeral for Heydrich, intended to turn his death into propaganda. His coffin, draped in swastikas, was paraded through Prague, then sent to Berlin, where Hitler, Himmler, and Göring attended the ceremony. Goebbels' propaganda ministry portrayed Heydrich as a martyr, the Iron Heart sacrificed for the Reich. Newspapers called him the man who built order from chaos. But behind the pageantry, a reign of terror descended upon the Czech people. The Gestapo conducted mass raids, rounding up anyone even remotely suspected of resistance ties. The Lidice and Ležáky massacres would soon become symbols of Nazi brutality. But the purge began long before those names were known. People vanished from their homes in the middle of the night. Entire families disappeared without trace. Hitler initially ordered that 10,000 Czechs be executed immediately, but Himmler and Karl Hermann Frank, the new acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia, convinced him to apply targeted vengeance that would serve as both punishment and warning. Even so, the results were catastrophic. The investigation into Heydrich's assassination moved with terrifying efficiency. Gestapo units interrogated captured members of the resistance, using torture that defied comprehension. Fingernails were ripped out, bones broken, family members killed before their eyes. Yet for weeks, Gabčík, Kubiš, and their fellow paratroopers remained hidden, ghosts within the very heart of Prague. While the search intensified, Hitler's wrath found an outlet in Lidice, a small village northwest of Prague. False intelligence suggested the assassins might have found refuge there. On June 10, 1942, SS troops surrounded the village. Every man over the age of 15, 172 in total, was lined up and shot. The women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Most of the 105 children were sent to gas chambers in Chelmno. The village itself was burned to the ground, its ruins bulldozed flat. Just 2 weeks later, the same fate befell the village of Ležáky, accused of harboring radio operators linked to the resistance. Every adult was executed, and the children were deported to extermination camps. The Nazis even removed the villages from maps, declaring that Lidice no longer exists. The horror reverberated across Europe. British and American newspapers published photos of the destruction, rallying public sympathy for the Czech cause. For the first time, the world recognized the Czech resistance as a legitimate fighting force. The act of defiance that killed Heydrich had succeeded in drawing global attention, but at a terrible cost. Meanwhile, the Gestapo continued to close in. Informants flooded in, motivated by fear or reward. Posters promised vast sums of money for any information about the assassins. In Prague, every home was searched, every contact questioned. Those caught aiding resistance fighters were executed on the spot. In this atmosphere of terror, some members of the resistance began to break under the pressure. On June 16, one such man, Karel Kurda, a fellow paratrooper from a different mission, made the fateful decision to betray his comrades. Afraid for his life and lured by a massive reward, he went to the Gestapo headquarters in Prague and revealed everything he knew about the network supporting Gabčík and Kubiš. His betrayal sealed their fate. The Gestapo now had the names, addresses, and hideouts of those sheltering the assassins. One by one, the brave civilians who had aided them, including the Moravec family, were arrested. Under torture, the Moravecs refused to speak. When the Gestapo brought their teenage son to see his mother, she took cyanide in front of him rather than betray her friends. The net was tightening. For Gabčík and Kubiš, hiding in the crypt of the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague, there was no illusion left. They knew the Gestapo would find them. It was only a matter of time. But surrender was never an option. If they were to die, they would do so on their own terms, as soldiers, not captives. By late June 1942, the city of Prague had become a fortress of fear. Posters promising rewards for information covered the walls. German patrols prowled every street. The Gestapo's presence was constant. Interrogations, arrests, executions. The once vibrant heart of Bohemia now beat under the boot of Nazi vengeance. Inside the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius, however, a small pocket of defiance endured. Beneath the Baroque structure on Rosslova Street, in a dim, stone-walled crypt accessible only through a narrow stairway, 7 paratroopers of the Czech resistance hid from the most powerful security apparatus in Europe. Among them were Jozef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, the assassins of Reinhard Heydrich. The crypt was dark and humid, its air thick with the smell of oil lamps and exhaustion. Water trickled down the ancient walls. Supplies were scarce: bread, a few tins of meat, and a limited supply of ammunition. They had been living underground for nearly 3 weeks, communicating only through loyal resistance contacts who risked their lives to bring food and news. Above ground, the Gestapo's dragnet tightened. After Karel Kurta's betrayal, the Germans had detailed maps of resistance safehouses. Dozens of arrests followed in rapid succession. Tortured prisoners gave up more names and locations. By June 18, 1942, the Gestapo was certain. The assassins were hiding in the church of St. Cyril and Methodius. At dawn, German trucks surrounded the church. Over 700 soldiers, including Gestapo, Waffen-SS, and local police, encircled the area under the command of SS Brigadeführer Karl Fischer von Treuenfeld. The Nazis demanded surrender through loudspeakers. Inside the church, the men exchanged glances. They knew what capture meant: torture, humiliation, execution. There was no discussion; they would fight to the death. The first shots rang out shortly after 4 a.m. German forces stormed the main nave, where 3 of the paratroopers, Adolf Apoka, Joseph Bublik, and Jan Ruby, were positioned. They fired from the choir loft and windows, holding back wave after wave of attackers. Bullet holes riddled the church's frescoed walls. The thunder of gunfire and grenades echoed through the sanctuary. The defenders were hopelessly outnumbered, but their courage was unshakable. They fought for more than 3 hours, taking down dozens of German soldiers before being overrun. When their ammunition ran out, Apoka turned his pistol on himself. Ruby and Bublik followed. None of them surrendered. Down below, in the crypt, Gabčík, Kubiš, and Josef Valsik listened to the battle raging above. Dust and plaster fell from the ceiling as explosions shook the church. They knew the upper defense had fallen. Soon it would be their turn. The Gestapo, realizing the remaining men were trapped below, tried flooding the crypt. They brought in fire hoses and poured torrents of water through the ventilation shafts, hoping to drown the resistance fighters alive. The paratroopers responded with gunfire, shouting defiantly through the roar of water. The Germans then used grenades and tear gas, but still the men refused to give in. In the chaos, Kubiš was gravely wounded by grenade shrapnel. He bled heavily but continued to fire, covering his comrades. When the Germans tried to force their way through the narrow entrance, Gabčík and Valsik shot through the doorway, killing several attackers. The crypt became a tomb and a fortress. The siege dragged on for nearly 6 hours. The Nazis brought in heavy weapons, drilled holes through the church floor, and tried to force the men out with smoke and shouting. But the resistance held fast. When it became clear that escape was impossible, the remaining paratroopers made their final choice. They destroyed their documents, divided their last bullets, and prepared to die. Jozef Gabčík, the man whose Sten gun had jammed that fateful morning, placed the barrel of his pistol beneath his chin. His last words, according to Gestapo reports, were simple: "We will never surrender." He pulled the trigger before the Germans could capture him. When the smoke cleared, the Nazis found 7 bodies, none taken alive. The church was desecrated, its walls scarred by bullets and grenades. The Gestapo ordered the priest and others who had aided the resistance executed. Over 260 people connected to the operation were later killed in reprisals. But the act of defiance did not die with them. The courage of the 7 men inside that crypt became a symbol, not only for Czechoslovakia but for the entire occupied world. The Church of St. Cyril and Methodius became hallowed ground, a testament to the idea that freedom, even in the face of certain death, is worth fighting for. The Nazis had extinguished the lives of the assassins, but not the idea they represented. That idea would outlive the Reich itself. When the smoke finally cleared over Rosslova Street, Prague fell eerily silent. The sound of gunfire that had echoed across the city that June morning faded into whispers. whispers of awe, disbelief, and grief. The Nazi authorities, shaken by the scale of resistance, immediately sealed off the area. The Church of St. Cyril and Methodius became both a crime scene and a symbol. To the Nazis, it was the lair of terrorists. To the Czech people, it became sacred ground. Inside the crypt, the bodies of the 7 paratroopers were photographed and catalogued by the Gestapo. The images were circulated as propaganda, a warning to others who might dream of rebellion. Yet, instead of inspiring fear, those photographs became silent icons of defiance. Even under the watchful eyes of German patrols, Prague citizens whispered their names in reverence. Gabčík, Kubiš, Valsik, Apaka, Bublik, Ruby, and Svark, the men who stood against the Reich. The Nazis buried their remains in an unmarked grave, hoping to erase their memory. But memories have a way of surviving oppression. In secret, flowers began appearing near the church. Women left candles in doorways. Men paused as they walked past, bowing their heads briefly. Despite the threat of execution, the city mourned its heroes. For the Nazis, Heydrich's death had created an unwanted martyr, not for Germany, but for Czechoslovakia. Hitler's regime tried to transform his funeral into a spectacle of strength. A lavish procession in Berlin featured black banners, thousands of SS officers, and Hitler himself paying tribute to the man he once called the perfect National Socialist. Yet beneath the pomp and the thunder of drums lay something the Nazis couldn't control: the quiet admiration spreading across Europe for the men who had killed him. Reports of the assassination and the brutal reprisals in Lidice and Ležáky spread through Allied news networks. British newspapers printed headlines like, "The Man Who Executed the Butcher of Prague," and "Czech Heroes Strike at Nazi Terror." In the United States, President Roosevelt condemned the massacres and praised the Czech resistance. Even in neutral countries, the story inspired shock and respect. Within weeks, the operation's impact reached far beyond Prague. The Czechoslovak government in exile in London, which had struggled for recognition, suddenly found itself thrust into the international spotlight. Before Heydrich's assassination, the 1938 Munich Agreement, which had allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland, remained a painful diplomatic reality. Britain and France still technically recognized it. But after the assassination, everything changed. Moved by the Czech resistance's bravery and horrified by Nazi reprisals, Winston Churchill's government officially annulled the Munich Agreement. For the first time since 1938, the Allies publicly declared their full support for the restoration of Czechoslovakia. In death, Heydrich's assassins had achieved something the exiled government could not accomplish through diplomacy. They had restored their nation's dignity. Yet for those who lived through it, the cost was unbearable. Entire families had been destroyed. The Moravecs, the very people who had hidden Gabčík and Kubiš, were executed. Their teenage son was tortured before being murdered. In villages across Bohemia, portraits of Heydrich hung beside lists of those executed in retaliation. Fear became part of daily life, but so did pride. In the months that followed, a quiet resistance persisted. Underground networks regrouped, distributing leaflets titled, "We Will Never Forget." Each carried the same haunting image: the church crypt with its bullet-scarred walls, now a symbol of sacrifice. Even among the Germans, Heydrich's death sowed unease. Himmler privately acknowledged that the loss of his protégé was a devastating blow to the SS internal cohesion. Heydrich had been more than a bureaucrat. He was the driving force behind many of the Reich's most ambitious and darkest projects. His absence left a vacuum, one that no other Nazi could truly fill. Historians later argued that Heydrich's assassination disrupted the Nazi administrative machine at a critical juncture. The coordination of the final solution slowed temporarily as rival officials vied for control of his vast intelligence network. The power vacuum sparked internal rivalries between Himmler, Kaltenbrunner, and other SS figures. While these struggles didn't stop the machinery of genocide, they introduced friction into the Nazi hierarchy, a ripple effect that would grow as the war turned against Germany. For Prague, however, the war dragged on. The streets still echoed with the boots of occupying soldiers, but the spirit of defiance had been rekindled. The people had seen what courage could achieve, even in the face of certain death. The assassins' final stand proved that tyranny, no matter how overwhelming, could be challenged, and that one act of resistance could echo louder than an empire's roar. As autumn descended on 1942, a single phrase began to circulate among Prague's resistance networks. They killed one man and awakened a nation. In the days and weeks following Heydrich's assassination, Prague became a city under siege. The Nazis unleashed what was, at that time, one of the most brutal manhunts in modern European history. Under the direct orders of Heinrich Himmler, the entire Gestapo, Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and Wehrmacht garrisons across Bohemia and Moravia were mobilized to track down the assassins and anyone who had aided them. Reinhard Heydrich's death had to be avenged. To the Nazis, it wasn't merely a loss of a senior officer. It was an insult to their authority, a slap to the face of the Reich itself. The word from Berlin was clear: find them, make them suffer, make an example so severe that no occupied people will dare to strike again. The investigation began with a level of precision and paranoia worthy of Heydrich himself. SS-Obergruppenführer Karl Hermann Frank, the Reich Secretary for Bohemia and Moravia, personally oversaw the operation. Roadblocks appeared across Prague. Random identity checks became a daily ritual. Curfews were enforced with machine guns. Loudspeakers blared warnings. Anyone withholding information about the perpetrators will be shot. Gestapo interrogators filled the cells of the Petschek Palace, the nerve center of Nazi terror in Prague. Prisoners were brought in by the dozens: resistance members, suspected sympathizers, and even people who had simply been seen near Reslova Street. Torture was systematic and relentless. Some prisoners were hung from their wrists for hours. Others were beaten with truncheons or burned with cigarettes. The aim wasn't justice, it was intimidation. Then a break came. The Gestapo found a clue. A minor resistance courier had been caught carrying forged documents linked to a man named Karel Kurda. Kurda had been part of Operation Anthropoid's broader support network, but he had gone into hiding after the assassination. Unlike his comrades, he lacked their resolve. As the Nazis increased their pressure, offering vast rewards for information, Kurda made a fateful choice that would brand his name with infamy for generations. On June 16, 1942, Kurda walked into Gestapo headquarters in Prague and confessed everything. He handed over names, addresses, safe houses, an entire web of resistance contacts. For 10 million Reichsmarks and a promise of safety, he betrayed his countrymen. That betrayal sealed the fate of hundreds. Using the information he provided, the Nazis launched a wave of arrests. Families connected to the resistance were torn apart. The Gestapo soon traced the assassin's path to the Orthodox Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius. But even then, they didn't know the men were hiding in the crypt below the altar. It was only after relentless interrogation of the Moravec family, one of the key links in the chain, that the final piece fell into place. The Gestapo stormed the Moravec household, capturing the mother and son. In one of the most horrifying episodes of the occupation, they tortured the family in front of each other. When 13-year-old Adam Moravec refused to talk, they executed him. His mother was shown his head in a glass jar to force a confession. She broke, revealing the church's location, and within hours, Nazi trucks were rolling toward Reslova Street. At dawn on June 18th, the Gestapo and SS surrounded the church with more than 700 men. The narrow cobbled streets echoed with the sound of armored vehicles and barking commands. Civilians were ordered to stay indoors. Machine guns were set up at every corner. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a siege of desperation. When the Nazis burst into the church, they found 3 resistance fighters on the upper floor. A fierce firefight erupted, bullets tearing through wooden pews and stained glass windows. After exhausting their ammunition, the men took their own lives rather than be captured. Then began the assault on the crypt below, where the remaining paratroopers were holed up. Grenades were thrown through the windows. Flood hoses were used in an attempt to drown them. The defenders fought with pistols and grenades, holding off the SS for 6 hours. In the end, surrounded and out of ammunition, they chose death over surrender. The last shots fired in the crypt were the sounds of men dying free. After the gunfire stopped, The Nazis dragged the bodies from the flooded chamber and laid them in the courtyard. The photographs taken that day show soldiers standing above the fallen heroes, their faces unreadable, part pride, part fear. Even the Gestapo officers who had overseen the massacre reportedly stood in silence. They had killed 7 men, but they knew they had unleashed something far greater, an idea that could not be drowned or silenced. In Berlin, when news reached Himmler that the assassins were dead, he declared the operation a total victory. But privately, within the upper ranks of the SS, there was unease. The manhunt had exposed cracks in their intelligence systems and had required an almost absurd level of manpower to kill 7 men. More importantly, the reprisals had backfired. Instead of crushing Czech resistance, they had inspired it. For decades after the war, Operation Anthropoid would be studied not only for its bravery but for its psychological impact on both sides. The Nazis had demonstrated their unmatched capacity for brutality, but they had also revealed their fear of defiance, fear of losing control, fear that even within their empire, there were those who refused to bow. Prague would remember the summer of 1942 not just as the season of terror, but as the moment when courage faced down tyranny, and left a scar on the Nazi psyche that would never fully heal. When word of Heydrich's death reached Berlin, the heart of the Nazi empire trembled. Not with sorrow, but with fury. To Adolf Hitler, it was unthinkable that one of his most ruthless and capable lieutenants could be brought down by a pair of exiled soldiers and a few hand grenades. In private meetings, Hitler reportedly screamed that the Czechs must be made to bleed for every drop of German blood. But beneath the outward rage was something the Führer rarely showed: fear. Reinhard Heydrich had been more than just another official. He was one of the pillars of Nazi administration. As chief of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, Heydrich had controlled the Gestapo, the SD, and all police intelligence networks across occupied Europe. His death didn't just eliminate a man, it fractured the architecture of the Nazi state. In the days that followed, Himmler, Kaltenbrunner, and Müller scrambled to redistribute Heydrich's authority. Heinrich Himmler himself temporarily assumed direct command of the RSHA but quickly realized how dependent the organization had become on Heydrich's meticulous, almost inhuman efficiency. Files were incomplete, operations delayed, and interdepartmental rivalries flared. Himmler's obsessive micromanagement couldn't replicate Heydrich's cold precision. Historians would later note that this administrative chaos subtly shifted the balance within the Nazi hierarchy. Without Heydrich's iron grip, the intelligence system began to fragment, giving rise to competition between the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the Foreign Office. Even within the RSHA, officials like Ernst Kaltenbrunner and Heinrich Müller vied for dominance, feeding Hitler reports that contradicted each other. A dangerous confusion in an empire obsessed with control. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Nazi regime turned Heydrich's funeral into a grotesque theater of martyrdom. His coffin, draped in a black SS flag embroidered with a silver death's head, lay in state beneath the towering columns of the Reich Chancellery. Uniformed officers stood in rigid formation as Hitler approached the bier, his face expressionless, his jaw tight. Behind him stood Himmler, visibly shaken, not only by grief but by the realization that he had lost his most competent enforcer. Heydrich's widow, Lena, watched the ceremony with a mix of grief and pride. She was awarded a lavish pension and a villa on the Baltic coast, yet her husband's name became a whispered curse even among fellow Nazis. The man with the iron heart, as Hitler had once called him, was now a ghost haunting their conscience. But while Berlin dressed the event in grandeur, the mood among the SS leadership was grim. They knew that Heydrich's assassination had exposed a critical vulnerability. The illusion of Nazi invincibility had been shattered. If two men could infiltrate a heavily guarded city, strike at one of the Reich's most feared leaders, and vanish into the crowd, what did that say about the regime's supposed control? Behind closed doors, the Nazis embarked on a campaign of vengeance masked as administrative reform. The Bohemian and Moravian Protectorate was placed under even tighter military rule. Entire districts were purged of suspected resistance members. The Gestapo expanded its surveillance apparatus, introducing new informant systems and population registries. Every citizen became a potential suspect. The Reich's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, faced a delicate problem. How could he spin Heydrich's death without showing weakness? His newspapers portrayed Heydrich as a fallen hero, assassinated by British cowards and their Czech accomplices. Posters were plastered across occupied Europe demanding vengeance for Heydrich. Yet, privately, Goebbels admitted in his diary that the assassination was a psychological disaster. It demonstrates, he wrote, that our enemies are capable of striking even at the core of our leadership. This will inspire others if not answered with total terror. The SS leadership took that warning to heart. The massacres at Lidice and Ležáky were not merely punitive. They were symbolic executions designed to drown resistance in blood. The idea was to make every occupied citizen think twice before daring to resist again. But in practice, the opposite happened. Across Europe, underground movements grew stronger. The legend of the Czech assassins spread through whispers and radio broadcasts, igniting a sense of possibility that tyranny could be fought and defeated. In the months following the assassination, even the Wehrmacht officers, many of whom secretly loathed the SS, began to talk of Heydrich's death as a sign. Some saw it as divine retribution. Others viewed it as a warning of what awaited the arrogant elite of the Nazi hierarchy. Ironically, it was within this environment of paranoia and mutual suspicion that seeds of future resistance within Germany itself were planted. Men like Claus von Stauffenberg, who would later lead the July 20th plot against Hitler, saw in the Czech operation proof that the Nazi regime could bleed. Meanwhile, in occupied Prague, the Gestapo's files swelled with the names of the executed, 1,357 in the first 3 months alone. Each page bore the same official justification: aiding in the assassination of the Reich protector. Heydrich's ghost lingered not as a hero to his comrades, but as a reminder of the fear he had inspired and the destruction he left behind. And yet, despite the terror, the myth of invincibility had died with him. Inside the SS, even hardened officers whispered that if Heydrich could be killed, no one was untouchable, not even Hitler himself. The ripples of the assassination continued to spread, invisible but unstoppable. Across Europe, resistance leaders studied the Czech operation as a case study in courage. In France, Norway, and Poland, whispers of new missions circulated through underground cells. The lesson was clear: an empire built on fear could be wounded, and one act of defiance could echo louder than an army. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich was a daring act that struck fear into the heart of the Nazi regime, but it unleashed a wave of retribution that would haunt Czechoslovakia for decades. The villages of Lidice and Ležáky became infamous, symbols of Nazi brutality and the terrible cost of resistance. The small village of Lidice, located northwest of Prague, had no connection to Heydrich's assassins. Its only fault was the presence of relatives of Czech resistance members and rumors that the village harbored sympathizers. On June 10, 1942, the Nazis descended on Lidice with a force of over 800 soldiers, encircling the village. Men aged 15 to 84 were separated from their families, rounded up in the town square, and executed by firing squads. Women and children were sent to concentration camps, with most children sent to extermination centers under the guise of Germanization programs. The destruction was total. Houses were set ablaze, churches dynamited, and livestock slaughtered. The streets were leveled, leaving only rubble and charred wood. Lidice was effectively erased from the map, its existence denied by the Reich as if it had never been. But the atrocity had the opposite effect of what the Nazis intended. News of Lidice spread worldwide, shocking the Allied powers and galvanizing public support for Czech resistance efforts. Similarly, the village of Ležáky, a smaller settlement northeast of Prague, faced the same fate. The Nazis accused it of harboring radio operators who had assisted Gabčík and Kubiš. On June 24, 1942, Gestapo units and SS troops surrounded the village. The male population was executed. The women and children were deported, many never to return. The village was razed completely. These massacres were designed as deterrents, but instead, they became rallying points for resistance movements across Europe. The courage of the Czech paratroopers and the suffering of these innocent civilians were immortalized in newspapers, leaflets, and clandestine broadcasts from London. They served as stark examples of both the brutality of the Nazis and the extraordinary bravery of ordinary people in defiance of tyranny. The psychological impact of these reprisals was profound. Fear spread through occupied territories. Families hid their sons. Communities became cautious of outsiders, and underground networks tightened their operations. Yet, at the same time, the actions of Gabčík and Kubiš demonstrated that the Nazis were not invincible. Their audacity inspired other resistance fighters in France, Poland, and Norway to attempt equally bold operations against German officers and collaborators. On an international scale, the massacres strengthened Allied resolve. London's broadcasts highlighted both the heroism of the assassins and the suffering of Lidice and Ležáky, using the narrative to justify intensified air campaigns and the strategic bombing of German-occupied areas. The moral outrage fueled recruitment into resistance networks and reinforced the legitimacy of the Czechoslovak government in exile. The memorialization of these events began even during the war. Survivors and exiled Czechs worked to document atrocities, collect testimonies, and ensure that the names of those killed, from the villages to the paratroopers themselves, would not be forgotten. These accounts, preserved in clandestine archives and later in post-war publications, painted a vivid picture of courage, sacrifice, and the tragic consequences of defying a totalitarian state. Decades later, Lidice was rebuilt as a living memorial. Monuments mark the exact locations of the destroyed homes, with plaques commemorating the lives lost. Annual ceremonies bring together survivors, descendants, and diplomats to remember the cost of freedom. Ležáky, though smaller, hosts a museum detailing the village's obliteration, displaying photographs, documents, and personal effects recovered from the aftermath. Historians continue to debate the long-term consequences of these reprisals. While the immediate effect was terror, the long-term impact was counterproductive for the Nazis. The destruction of Lidice and Ležáky did not crush Czech morale. It immortalized resistance as a noble, if deadly, path. The courage of those who aided Gabčík and Kubiš, even at the cost of their lives, became emblematic of the human spirit confronting tyranny. By linking acts of audacious defiance with catastrophic reprisals, the story of Lidice and Ležáky illustrates the paradox of resistance under occupation. One act of bravery can inspire a nation, but the cost is often measured in lives of innocents. Yet, the legacy persists. The villages, though physically obliterated, live on in memory and in history, standing as eternal reminders that tyranny cannot erase courage, no matter how much blood it spills. The Czech people, scarred but undeterred, rebuilt their communities, preserving the memory of both the assassins and the innocent victims. Internationally, the story of Heydrich's assassination and the subsequent massacres became a powerful narrative about sacrifice, courage, and the moral responsibility to resist oppression. A narrative that continues to educate and inspire generations around the world. The story of Reinhard Heydrich's assassination and the bravery of Jozef Gabčík, Jan Kubiš, and their fellow paratroopers did not end with the fall of the Third Reich. Its legacy reverberated across generations, shaping not only the collective memory of Czechoslovakia but also the broader understanding of resistance during World War II. After the war, Czechoslovakia faced the daunting task of rebuilding, physically, socially, and morally. The devastation in villages like Lidice and Ležáky, the persecution of civilians, and the heroism of the paratroopers became central elements in the national narrative. Memorials and museums were established to honor those who had sacrificed their lives for freedom. Lidice, reconstructed as a symbol of remembrance, became a global site of commemoration, drawing visitors from across Europe and North America. Plaques, monuments, and annual ceremonies ensured that the memory of the victims and heroes would endure. In Prague, the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius remains a sacred site. Tourists and students alike walk its quiet corridors, pausing at the crypt where Gabčík and Kubiš made their final stand. Inside, plaques and photographs detail the operation and the subsequent Nazi reprisals. The church stands not only as a memorial to the fallen but as a living reminder of courage in the face of tyranny. Internationally, the assassination of Heydrich has become a key case study in military and intelligence history. Scholars analyze Operation Anthropoid for its meticulous planning, daring execution, and strategic impact. Military academies across Europe and the United States use it to teach lessons about asymmetric warfare, intelligence operations, and the psychological effects of targeted strikes on occupying forces. The mission demonstrates how a small, well-trained team can influence the course of a larger conflict through courage, ingenuity, and determination. The narrative also entered cultural memory. Films, documentaries, books, and theatrical productions have recounted the story of Heydrich's assassination, the courage of the paratroopers, and the tragic fate of civilians caught in the crossfire. Productions such as the 2011 film Anthropoid and numerous documentaries explore not only the action but the moral and ethical dilemmas faced by those resisting a brutal regime. These adaptations serve to educate modern audiences about the realities of life under occupation and the extraordinary measures taken to fight oppression. Educational programs in Czech schools incorporate the story into lessons about World War II, citizenship, and moral responsibility. Students learn about the paratroopers' meticulous training, the risks undertaken by ordinary citizens who provided shelter, and the harrowing consequences of defiance. Through these lessons, the story of Heydrich's assassination fosters an understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the complexities of resistance under tyranny. The assassination also had lasting political implications. The audacity of the operation highlighted the role of the Czechoslovak government in exile in London and increased international recognition of their efforts to coordinate resistance. Allied leaders praised the operation, noting how it disrupted Nazi administration and bolstered Czech morale. It became emblematic of the principle that oppressed peoples could fight back against overwhelming forces, influencing post-war narratives of national resilience and sovereignty. Families of the paratroopers and of the victims of Nazi reprisals have preserved personal artifacts, letters, and photographs, creating a living archive of memory. These collections, often donated to museums or used in scholarly research, provide invaluable insight into the human dimensions of the operation, the fears, hopes, and unwavering resolve of those involved. Decades later, the impact of Heydrich's assassination continues to inspire resistance movements worldwide. From anti-colonial struggles to modern conflicts, the narrative demonstrates the power of individual and collective courage against authoritarian regimes. It underscores a universal truth. Even the most oppressive systems can be challenged when ordinary people act with extraordinary resolve. In contemporary Prague, commemorations include ceremonies attended by foreign dignitaries, military officials, and schoolchildren. The legacy of Gabčík and Kubiš transcends national boundaries, illustrating that heroism is not confined by geography or time. Each year, on June 18th, the anniversary of the Krips siege, the Czech people honor the paratroopers with wreaths, flags, and moments of silence. Ultimately, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich and the subsequent events left an indelible mark on history. The courage of a few men, combined with the sacrifices of countless civilians, demonstrated that tyranny, no matter how powerful, can be challenged. The paratroopers' bravery, the village's tragic fates, and the moral lessons learned continue to echo through generations. They remind us that heroism is often costly but always consequential, that acts of resistance, no matter how small or dangerous, can resonate far beyond their immediate moment, shaping the course of nations and the conscience of the world.